November 14th, 1957. A quiet property in the hills of Appalachian, New York. Inside, 63 men in expensive suits sat around tables, talking about territory, money, and murder. Outside, state troopers were moving in. When the raid started, these men, the most powerful criminals in America, ran away like frightened animals. But one man, a 61-year-old gentleman with gray hair and a calm presence, walked slowly to his car, fixed his tie, and got ready to face whatever was coming. His name was Michele Miranda, and he had spent 40 years learning how to survive in the most dangerous business on earth. This is his story, the story of Big Mike Miranda, the man who helped create the American Mafia, who worked for 3 different bosses, who controlled criminal empires from behind the scenes, and who against all odds passed away peacefully in his own bed at age 77. A very unusual ending for a man who spent his life in the underworld. Before we start this amazing trip through one of the most interesting lives in organized crime history, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching right now? What time is it there? Are you getting ready for sleep? Or maybe you are already dozing off. Leave a comment and tell me if you enjoy these detailed, relaxing crime stories that take you through history. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your alerts. You will not want to miss the next one. And if you are ready to spend the next few hours with Big Mike Miranda, show some appreciation. Hit that like button and share this with someone who enjoys real mob history. Now, let us go back to the start. Back to a small village in southern Italy, where a boy was born who would one day help build the American underworld. On July 26, 1896, in the small town of San Giuseppe Vesuviano in the province of Naples, Campania region of southern Italy, a boy was born who would one day help build the entire American underworld. His parents gave him the name Michele Miranda, a common name in a place where family, respect, and staying alive were the only things that really counted. San Giuseppe Vesuviano sits at the base of Mount Vesuvius, southeast of Naples, in an area with rich volcanic soil where grapevines and fruit trees struggle against the threat of the volcano, and where life has always been difficult. In 1896, Italy had been a single country for only 35 years. But being one country had not made life better in the southern regions. If anything, things had become more difficult. The Italy of Michele's childhood was a place of sharp differences and old social systems. The North built factories, while the South stayed stuck in old ways. Rich landowners, the latifondisti, controlled huge farms worked by poor farmers who lived in conditions barely changed from the Middle Ages. There was almost no middle class. You were either born with land and money, or you were born to work until your body gave out. The Miranda family were contadini, farm workers. They worked land they did not own, growing crops they could not keep. They lived in stone houses with dirt floors and no running water. Michele's father got up before sunrise and came home after sunset. His hands were rough and cracked, his back bent from years of hard work. His mother cooked whatever they could pay for or grow, fixed clothes until they were more patches than original cloth, and had children knowing that not all of them would live to grow up. This was normal. This was how millions of southern Italians lived at the start of the century. Many babies died. Sickness was everywhere. Schooling was hard to get. Most children worked next to their parents as soon as they were strong enough. The Catholic Church gave people hope, but not much practical help. The faraway government in Rome took taxes, but gave almost nothing back. In this kind of world, certain ideas became extremely important. Family was everything. It was the only group you could really count on. Honor was very important. Your word was your promise, because you had nothing else of value. Respect came from being strong and keeping it by always being careful. And keeping quiet, omerta, was the key to staying alive, because the police were often just as dangerous as the criminals. This was the world that shaped Michele Miranda. He learned early that the world was split between people who had power and people who did not, and that the law existed to protect the powerful from everyone else. He learned that being loyal to family and friends was the most important rule, and that betraying someone was the worst thing you could do. He learned to watch, to listen, to think before talking, and to trust his gut feelings, but most importantly, he learned that the way things were set up offered no way up for people like him. Working hard meant you survived, not that you got ahead. Being honest meant your neighbors respected you, not that rich people would. The system was unfair, and everyone knew it in this situation. Organized crime was not something strange and different. It was another system, one that gave chances to people who could not get ahead by following the rules. In Campania, this meant the Camorra, a criminal group older than Italy itself. The Camorra controlled markets, smuggling, gambling, and protection money. They settled arguments that the distant courts would never handle. They gave loans when banks would not. And they got respect by being scary, and also by being part of the community. Young Michele would have seen camorristi in the local towns. Men who dressed better than farmers, but were not rich. Who had money without owning land. Who got respect without having titles. These men showed a third choice between very hard poverty and an unreachable upper class. They were criminals, yes, but in a world where the law itself was criminal, because it did not care about suffering. What did that difference really mean? The stories Michele heard as a child would have included tales of honor and revenge, of wrongs made right and respect kept. In southern Italian culture, a man who let someone insult him and did nothing was not really a man. A man who told the police about others was worse than dirt. A man who protected his family and his interests by any means necessary was doing what any real man should do. This was not a culture that made criminals because people were bad. It was a culture that made survivors because people had to adapt to impossible situations. And Michele Miranda was a survivor, but surviving in San Giuseppe Vesuviano meant just getting by, not getting ahead by the early 1900s. Michele would have known very well that his future, if he stayed, was already decided. He would work land he would never own, marry a local girl, have children who would face the same limited future, grow old before his time, and die in the same poverty he was born into. Year after year, the same story, unless he left. In the 1890s and 1900s, a huge number of southern Italians made the same choice Michele would make. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians moved to the United States. They left poverty behind, yes, but they also left a social system that gave them nothing. They had heard the stories, America, the land of opportunity, where a man could get ahead by working, where the past did not control the future, where streets were supposedly made of gold. Most of these stories were made bigger than the truth. Many were complete lies told by shipping companies to sell tickets. But they had a small piece of truth that made them hard to resist. In America, you could try. You could work, save money, build something. You were not stuck in an old system from the Middle Ages. The promise was not wealth. It was the chance to try. For a young man like Michele, probably in his mid-teens by 1910, the choice to leave would have been both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it meant escaping a future that was already picked out for him. Terrifying because it meant leaving everyone and everything he knew. crossing an ocean to a country where he did not know the language, where he had no friends or family, where he would be starting from nothing in a society that already looked down on Italian newcomers as criminals and bad people. But the Miranda family made the choice that millions of southern Italian families made. They would send their young men to America. These men would work, save money, and send some back home if they did well. If they did very well, they might bring other family members over. If they failed, at least they had tried. The exact year Michele came to America is lost because records from that time are not perfect. But it was probably between 1910 and 1914. Before World War I made ocean travel very hard, he would have been in his mid to late teens, old enough to work, young enough to adjust to a new country. He might have traveled alone or with relatives. He definitely traveled in steerage, the cheapest way, packed in with hundreds of other immigrants in the bottom part of a steamship. The trip took 1 to 2 weeks depending on the ship and the weather. It was awful. Steerage passengers were crowded into big sleeping rooms with hardly any bathrooms. There was very little fresh air and not enough food. Almost everyone got seasick. Sickness spread fast in the crowded spaces. People died on these trips, not many, but enough that everyone knew it could happen. But Michele survived the trip, just as he would survive everything else life threw at him. And one day, standing on the deck as the ship came into New York Harbor, he would have seen America for the first time. The first thing every newcomer saw was the Statue of Liberty, put up in 1886, her torch raised to welcome the tired, the poor, the crowded masses wanting to be free. The sad joke of this would become clear soon enough. But in that moment, sailing past that huge symbol of hope, Michele Miranda would have felt what every newcomer felt. A mix of hope, fear, and determination. The second thing he saw was Ellis Island. Ellis Island, the door to America. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million immigrants passed through its buildings. For most, it was a 6-hour experience of medical checks, questions, and worry. For some, it was the end of their American dream before it even started. Sent back for sickness, possible criminal past, or not having enough money, Michele would have moved through lines with hundreds of others. His few things in a cheap suitcase or bag, doctors would have looked at him for clear signs of illness. Eye disease, tuberculosis, mental problems. Officials would have asked him about where he was going, what job he could do, whether he could support himself. The questions were asked through translators, which made everything more confusing and scary. But Michele passed the checks. As most did, he was young, healthy, and said he had work waiting. Whether this was true or a hopeful story, it was enough. He was approved, given papers, then sent to the boat that would take him to Manhattan. His first real look at New York City would have been completely overwhelming. In the 1910s, New York was already a huge city of almost 5 million people. Getting bigger every day, the skyline was starting to grow tall. The Woolworth Building, finished in 1913, was 792 feet tall, the tallest building in the world. The streets were packed with people from every country, horses, carriages, and the new cars created constant noise and traffic jams. Electric lights were becoming normal. The subway system was growing. Everything was bigger, faster, louder than anything Michele had ever seen. But Michele did not have time to be a sightseer. He had to survive. Most Italian immigrants went straight to Little Italy or East Harlem, neighborhoods where Italian was spoken, where community existed, where newly arrived immigrants could find a place to live and work through networks of family and people from the same hometown. Michele settled in East Harlem, which by the 1910s was becoming the largest Italian neighborhood in the city. East Harlem, or Italian Harlem, stretched roughly from 96th Street to 125th Street between 3rd Avenue and the East River. By 1920, more than 100,000 Italians lived in this very crowded neighborhood. The streets were named after American presidents and numbered in the American style, but the culture was pure Southern Italy. Italian was the main language. Stores sold Italian food. Newspapers were printed in Italian. Social clubs were organized by where people came from in Italy. Calabrians here, Sicilians there, people from Campania in another spot. This was both a good thing and a trap. The good thing was community, a support system for immigrants struggling in a foreign land. The trap was being separate. Many immigrants never learned English, never became part of American society, and never escaped the poor neighborhood. Michele's first years in America would have been extremely hard. He probably lived in a tenement, a multi-story building with apartments so small that whole families shared 1 or 2 rooms. Bathrooms were shared between many families. Running water was often just 1 tap in the hallway. In summer, the buildings were like ovens. In winter, not enough heat left people shivering. He would have worked whatever jobs he could find. The docks were a big place for work. Loading and unloading ships needed thousands of strong men. Construction was another option. New York was always building. And Italians did much of the labor. Factories needed workers. Restaurants needed kitchen help. The pay was terrible. The hours were long. The work was hard and often dangerous. This was the real American dream for most immigrants. Yes, there was more chance than in Italy, but that chance came with very hard work. Unfair treatment, being taken advantage of, and poverty that was often as bad or worse than what they had left. The unfair treatment was real and everywhere. Italian immigrants were seen by Americans whose families had been there longer, and by earlier immigrant groups, as criminals, troublemakers, and bad people. Newspapers often wrote about Italians as violent and likely to be criminals. Signs saying, "No Italians need apply," were common. Lynchings of Italian immigrants happened in the South. The prejudice came from a fear of newcomers, racism. Italians were not considered fully white at the time, and religious bigotry. Protestant America looked at Catholic immigrants with suspicion. In this situation, turning to crime was not a moral failure. It was a reasonable response to a system that offered very few legal ways to get ahead. If honest work barely paid enough to live, if unfair treatment blocked any chance to move up, if the law itself was crooked, and police were often more criminal than the criminals they were supposed to catch, why not take chances in the illegal economy? By the late 1910s, Michele would have been in his early 20s. He had survived moving to America. He spoke enough English to get by, though Italian was still his main language. He understood how the neighborhood worked, who had power, how money moved through legal and illegal channels, and he would have noticed the wise guys. The men who dressed better, ate better, got respect, and did not break their backs for pennies. These men ran the neighborhood's gambling, controlled construction rackets, settled arguments, and generally acted as a second government. They were the American version of the Camorra he had seen in Italy. But with one big difference, the chances were bigger. The organized crime structure in East Harlem in the 1910s was still fairly simple. The main family was the Morello crime family, led by Giuseppe, Peter the Clutch Hand Morello, and later by Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria. They controlled gambling, prostitution, taking money from businesses, and making fake money. Violence was common. This was the time of the Black Hand letters that scared Italian communities. Michele's entry into this world was probably slow. Maybe he started by taking bets or number guesses for neighbors, getting a small share. Maybe he did occasional work as a lookout or a messenger. Maybe he saw violence and kept his mouth shut, showing he could be trusted. However, it started by his mid-20s. Michele Miranda was part of the life. Then came Prohibition. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, stopping the making, selling, and moving of alcohol in the United States. It was meant to make people more moral and healthy. Instead, it created the biggest criminal opportunity in American history. Americans wanted to drink. Prohibition did not change that. It just made drinking against the law. This created a need for illegal alcohol, which created opportunity for anyone willing to provide it. And the profits were huge for the Italian organized crime families. Prohibition changed everything. Before 1920, they were local street gangs running small-time illegal businesses. After 1920, they became rich criminal companies with the money to bribe police, politicians, and judges on a scale never seen before. Michele was in the right place at the right time, in his mid-20s. With 10 years of experience in America and several years in the criminal world, he was perfectly placed to take advantage of Prohibition's opportunities. Bootlegging required organization. Someone had to bring in or make the alcohol. Someone had to move it. Someone had to sell it to speakeasies and private customers. Someone had to handle money and payoffs. Someone had to deal with rivals through talking or violence. The operation needed planning, money management, handling people, and talking to others. The skills of a business, not just a gang. Michele proved to be good at the business side of crime. He was not the most flashy gangster or the most violent, but he could be counted on. He was smart, and he was careful. When he said he would deliver a shipment, he delivered it. When he said he would take care of a problem, he took care of it. When he needed to keep his mouth shut, he stayed silent. These qualities got him noticed by the bosses in the 1920s. This meant Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, who was taking control of Italian organized crime in New York. Masseria was old school, a mustache Pete. As the younger generation called the traditional bosses, he believed in the old ways. Only Italians could be members, personal loyalty, violent solutions to arguments, and the usual illegal businesses. But working under Masseria, a new group was coming up. Men like Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello. They had different ideas. They saw organized crime as a business that should run like a company. They believed in working with non-Italians, especially Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. When it helped both sides, they thought violence should be planned, not done out of anger. They wanted to modernize. Michele worked for Masseria, but he paid attention to the young ones. He understood that they were the future, and when the time came to pick a side, Michele would make the right choice. The 1920s were great times for organized crime, and Michele Miranda was learning his job during the best years of the bootlegger. By his mid-20s, he was a made member of what would later be called the Genovese crime family, but which at the time was still the Masseria family. Being made, formally accepted into the Mafia, was the most important moment in a mobster's life. It meant you were no longer just someone who worked with them. You were a soldier, a member of a family, tied by oath and blood to your brothers in crime. The ceremony was secret, but people knew the general idea. A promise of loyalty, a finger pricked to draw blood. Sometimes a picture of a saint burned to show what happens to those who betray. Once made, you are in for life. The only way out was death, but being made was just the beginning. What mattered was what you did with that membership. Some soldiers stayed soldiers their whole lives, following orders, earning enough to get by, never moving up others. Through a mix of intelligence, wanting to get ahead, and being willing to do what was necessary, climbed the ladder. Michele was a climber, but a careful one. He understood that in the Mafia, as in any group, relationships were everything. You needed to make money for your bosses. That was the main requirement, but you also needed to build trust, show you could be counted on, and prove you had good judgment. The wise guys who acted on emotion, who were quick to use violence, who talked too much, they often ended up dead before they were 30. Michele built a different reputation. He was calm, thoughtful, and good at talking when there were arguments. He looked for solutions that helped everyone, rather than insisting on getting his way. When violence was needed, he was ready, but he did not look for it. When bosses asked what he thought, he gave honest advice, and most importantly, when secrets needed to be kept, Michele was a vault. His main operations in the 1920s were in East Harlem, which stayed the center of his world his whole life. He ran gambling, policy, numbers, dice games, card games. He had a share in speakeasies that sold illegal alcohol. He was involved in taking money from labor unions, especially in construction, where Italian immigrants controlled certain jobs. He collected protection money from businesses, giving them real protection from rivals in exchange for regular payments. These operations needed constant attention. Gamblers had to be watched to stop stealing. Money had to be collected and passed up to the bosses. Arguments had to be settled. Police had to be paid off. Competitors had to be warned away or dealt with more permanently. It was a full-time job that required organization, discipline, and the ability to handle people, many of whom were violent, greedy, and could not be trusted. Michele was also learning the political side of crime. Organized crime did not operate in a bubble. It existed because police, politicians, and judges let it exist for a price. The Mafia's relationship with Tammany Hall, New York's crooked political machine, was a two-way street. The mob delivered votes, provided strong-arm help during elections, and shared profits with politicians. In return, politicians provided protection, early warning of raids, and better treatment in the courts. Understanding this system was very important. The gangsters who treated police as enemies ended up in prison or dead. The gangsters who built relationships with the right police captains, judges, and local politicians did well. Michele was in the second group. He built relationships carefully, paid his share on time, and never gave the police a reason to make an example of him. But even with his careful approach, Michele could not avoid violence completely. The bootlegging business was very competitive, and people fought over territory. Stealing shipments was common. Rival gangs would take each other's alcohol instead of bringing in their own. Arguments over territory led to shootings. Informers and people thought to be traitors were killed. This was the time of the Tommy gun and gangland killings. Bodies found in alleys and gangsters shot down on the street in broad daylight. Michele was arrested a few times during the 1920s. Small charges mostly, just part of the job: assault, having illegal alcohol, carrying a hidden weapon. But he always got out of the charges or paid small fines. His arrest record was there, marking him as a known criminal to law enforcement. But he never did serious time in prison. This was partly luck, partly good lawyers, and partly the corruption that let connected gangsters avoid punishment. By the late 1920s, Michele was in his early 30s and well established. He was a capo, a captain, running his own crew and making a lot of money. He had a reputation as someone you could count on, who could handle complicated situations without losing his cool. He was respected by others at his level and valued by those above him. But problems were coming. Prohibition had made everyone rich, but it had also created tensions that the old-school bosses could not handle. Joe the Boss Masseria controlled Manhattan. Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian boss, controlled Brooklyn and parts of the Bronx. Both men wanted complete control, and neither was willing to share. The Castellamarese War was coming. The Castellamarese War, named after Maranzano's hometown in Sicily, was the fight that would shape organized crime for the next generation. It was a war between old and new, between Sicilian traditions and American new ideas, between rule by one person and a company structure, and Michele Miranda would get through it perfectly. The war started in early 1930 and lasted until September 1931. On the surface, it was a simple fight for power between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, two bosses who each claimed to be the boss of all bosses and could not both exist. But underneath, it was a fight between generations. Masseria and Maranzano were both mustache Petes, traditional bosses who ran their families like old-fashioned rulers. They demanded personal loyalty. They settled arguments with violence. They insisted that only Italians could be members. They saw organized crime as an extension of Sicilian ways brought to America. But many of the men under them saw things differently. Men like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Kostlo, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel believed the old ways were holding them back. They wanted to organize crime like a modern business. They were willing to work with non-Italians when it helped both sides. They thought the idea of one boss over all bosses caused unnecessary conflict. They wanted to make money, not prove points about honor. As the war started, Michele was a captain in the Masseria family. His loyalty should have been automatic, but Michele was watching carefully and thinking ahead. He saw that Masseria was short-sighted, violent without purpose, and making enemies for no good reason. He saw that the young ones, especially Luciano, had a vision and plans that made sense. Luciano was playing both sides officially. He was Masseria's second in command, but secretly he was talking to Maranzano and getting ready to end the war in a way that would help the next generation. Not the old guard. The war itself was brutal. Between 1930 and 1931, at least 60 gangsters were killed in New York, many in shocking ways, drive-by shootings. Bodies dumped in the street to send messages. The violence was bad for business. It attracted police attention, messed up operations, and made things unpredictable. Everyone wanted it to end, but neither Masseria nor Maranzano would back down. Michele kept a low profile during this time, running his operations, staying out of the direct line of fire, and waiting to see which way things would go. This was smart. Ambitious gangsters who took big roles in the war often ended up dead. The survivors were those who did their jobs well, without putting targets on themselves. On April 15, 1931, the war took a big turn. Joe the Boss Masseria was having lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a restaurant in Coney Island. He was there with Lucky Luciano, his most trusted helper. After eating, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 gunmen, probably including Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel, came into the restaurant and shot Masseria to death. Luciano not being there during the murder was suspicious, but he said he was innocent in reality. He had arranged the killing as part of a deal with Maranzano to end the war. Miseria was the problem, so Miseria had to go with Miseria dead. Maranzano declared himself the winner and boss of all bosses. He reorganized New York's Italian organized crime into 5 families, the setup that still exists today. The families were led by Luciano Maranzano himself, Tommy Gagliano, Joseph Profacchi, and Vincent Mangano. Maranzano declared himself the top authority over all 5 families. Michele got through the change easily. He was now a captain in what was technically the Luciano family, though it would soon be known as the Genovese family after Vito Genovese. His operations continued. His income stayed strong. He had successfully gotten through the most dangerous time in New York, organized crime by being good at his job, but not too noticeable. Loyal, but not blindly so, but the peace lasted only 5 months. Maranzano had become what he replaced, a boss who demanded total obedience and payments. Worse, he was planning to get rid of the young ones who had helped him win the war. Luciano, Genovese, Costello, and others were all on his hit list. He saw them as too ambitious, too independent, too American, but Luciano saw it coming. On September 10th, 1931, less than 5 months after Miseria's death, Luciano struck first. He sent a team of gunmen, non-Italians, so they would get past Maranzano's guards without being recognized, to Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building, pretending to be federal agents. They got past the guards and shot Maranzano to death in a single day. Luciano got rid of the boss of all bosses and made sure no one would ever hold that title again. The Castellamarese War was over, and the modern American Mafia was born. Michele Miranda, now in his mid-30s, had survived and done well through one of the bloodiest times in mob history. He had shown loyalty to his bosses while quietly supporting the ones who wanted change. He had avoided making enemies. He had kept his operations running and making money. And now he was in a perfect position in the new system that Luciano was creating. The commission was about to be born, and Michele would be part of the group that would rule organized crime in America for the next 50 years. After Maranzano's death, Lucky Luciano did something completely new. He refused to become the next boss of all bosses. Instead, he created a new system, the Commission. The Commission was Organized Crime's board of directors. It was made up of the bosses of the 5 New York families, plus representatives from major families in other cities: Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, and later others. The commission would settle arguments, approve big decisions like murders of made members, divide territories, and generally provide structure to what had been messy competition. This was Luciano's smart idea. Instead of demanding that others follow him, he offered partnership. Instead of ruling through fear, he proposed ruling through agreement and shared interests. It was a business model applied to crime, and it worked really well. The 5 New York families set up in 1931 became the foundation of American organized crime. The Luciano family, later the Genovese family, was first among equals. The Mangano family, later the Gambino family, controlled the Brooklyn docks. The Gagliano family, later the Lucchese family, controlled taking money from labor unions. The Profacci family, later the Colombo family, controlled parts of Brooklyn. The Bonanno family, led by Joseph Bonanno, operated in Brooklyn and other areas. Michele Miranda was a captain in the Luciano family, which meant he was part of the most powerful group in the new setup. Michele's area was centered on Lower Manhattan and Little Italy, with strong ties to the garment district areas that stayed important to his operations for decades. And his bosses were the best of the new generation. Lucky Luciano as boss, Vito Genovese as underboss, and Frank Costello as a major power broker. The 1930s were a time of growth and strengthening for the newly organized mafia. With the structure stable and fighting between families over, the families could focus on making money, and there was money everywhere. Even though Prohibition ended in 1933, organized crime had spread out. Gambling was still huge. Policy, numbers running, dice games, card games, sports betting. The profits were great because the costs were low and people always wanted it. Poor people especially played the numbers, hoping for a big win that would change their lives. The chances of winning were terrible, but hope was cheap. Taking money from labor unions became more and more complex. The families controlled important unions, especially in construction, clothing manufacturing, and the waterfront. This control let them take money from both sides. They charged employers for no strikes and workers for jobs. They could also stop businesses or whole industries with strikes, which gave them a lot of power. The waterfront, New York's docks, became especially profitable. The docks were where goods came into and left the city, which meant controlling the docks meant controlling trade. The families ran the longshoremen's unions, which gave them power over who got hired. Working conditions and cargo, they stole goods, ran protection businesses, and controlled who worked and who did not. Honest dock workers paid for their jobs. Companies paid to avoid strikes or theft. Michele's operations in East Harlem were smaller versions of these bigger rackets. He ran local gambling, collected from businesses, had interests in labor unions, and generally controlled the neighborhood's illegal economy. He employed dozens of people directly and controlled hundreds more indirectly. The money flowed up the chain. He took his share and passed the rest to his bosses, who took their share and passed it up further. This pyramid setup made sure everyone made money, and everyone had a reason to keep the system running smoothly. But Michele was not just making money. He was building relationships. This was the time when he made the connections that would help him for decades. His relationship with Lucky Luciano was very important. Luciano was the one with the vision, the organizer, the man who saw the big picture. Michele was not a new idea person like Luciano, but he was something just as valuable, someone who could be counted on to get things done. When Luciano needed someone to handle a delicate situation, Michele was the kind of man he could trust to do it quietly and well. Michele's relationship with Vito Genovese was more complicated. Genovese was ambitious, violent, and suspicious. Everything Michele was not, but Genovese was also underboss of the family and could not be ignored. Michele handled this relationship carefully, showing respect without getting too close. This distance would prove smart in the years to come. His relationship with Frank Costello was perhaps the most important of all. Costello was the prime minister of the underworld, the mob's connection to politics, police, and legal business. He was smooth, sophisticated, and believed in making money with brains rather than bullets. Michele and Costello were alike in this way. They both understood that violence was sometimes needed, but should never be the first choice. They both valued stability over attention. They both thought about the long term. Michele also built relationships outside his own family. He worked with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who were partners with Luciano in many businesses. He knew and respected bosses from other families: Joseph Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino. These relationships were not friendships in the normal way. Everyone was always trying to get ahead, but they were built on mutual respect and the understanding that working together was better than fighting. During this time, Michele was also building his public image. He kept legal businesses as cover and sources of legal money. These might have included restaurants, bars, import-export businesses, or real estate. These legal businesses served several purposes. They hid illegal money, gave him things he could deduct on his taxes, created legal jobs for family members and associates, and gave Michele a respectable public face. He lived well, but not in a showy way. He had a nice home, dressed well, ate at good restaurants. But he did not attract attention with big houses or lots of fancy cars. His restraint was partly his personality. Michele was not flashy and partly smart planning. The gangsters who lived like movie stars attracted IRS attention and public anger. The gangsters who lived like successful businessmen could operate more freely. Michele also started a family during this time. Though details are hard to find, he got married, had children, and kept a home life separate from his criminal activities. This separation between work and home was normal for mobsters of his time. Their families often knew or guessed what they did, but they did not ask questions. Wives did not ask. Children were told their fathers were in business or garbage collection or something vague. Then came 1936, and the good times started to get worse. Thomas Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor, went after Lucky Luciano with everything he had. Unable to make murder or bootlegging charges stick, Dewey charged Luciano with running prostitution rings. Basically being a pimp, it was a stretch legally. But Dewey made it work by scaring witnesses and finding a helpful judge. In April 1936, Luciano was found guilty and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Basically a life sentence. Luciano's conviction was a disaster for the family, but a chance for others. With Luciano in prison, someone had to run the family. That someone was Frank Costello. Vito Genovese was technically underboss, but in 1937, he ran away to Italy to avoid murder charges, leaving Costello in charge. For Michele, this was actually good. Costello was someone he respected and could work with, and Costello's way of leading suited Michele perfectly. Make money, avoid violence when possible, keep political connections, run things quietly and professionally. The late 1930s were fairly peaceful for the mob. The commission setup was working. The families were making money. Police pressure was manageable. Michele kept building his reputation and operations, steadily moving up in status within the family. Then came World War II, which would change everything. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, America entered World War II. And like every other part of American society, organized crime was changed by the war effort. The government needed the mob, though it would never admit it publicly. The waterfront had to be protected from sabotage and spying, and the mob controlled the waterfront. The war effort needed no strikes, and the mob controlled important unions. Supplies had to move efficiently, and the mob controlled shipping and trucking. The government needed help, and the mob was willing to provide it. For a price, the most famous example of mob help was Operation Underworld, though the full details would not come out for years. In 1942, the Navy approached Lucky Luciano in prison through messengers. They wanted help protecting the New York docks from German saboteurs and gathering information for the invasion of Sicily. Luciano agreed to help, making arrangements through Meyer Lansky and other associates. How much Luciano actually helped is debated, but the fact that the government came to him at all showed how powerful the mob had become, and the cooperation paid off for Luciano after the war. His sentence was reduced. and he was sent back to Italy rather than serving the rest of his 30 to 50-year sentence. For Michele and other mobsters who were not in prison, the war years were profitable. With millions of men in the military, workers were hard to find, which gave unions more power. With rationing in place, black markets grew for everything from gasoline to meat to sugar. The mob, with its existing delivery networks and willingness to ignore laws, was perfectly placed to profit from wartime shortages. Michele's operations grew during the war. He was now in his late 40s. A senior captain with decades of experience and a reputation for being dependable. He had survived the Castellamarese War, adjusted to the commission setup, and done well under Costello's leadership. He was making a lot of money and getting respect from others at his level and from bosses. The war also brought changes to the Italian-American community. Many young Italian-Americans served bravely in the military, earning respect and becoming part of American society. The children and grandchildren of immigrants were becoming fully American, losing the Italian language and old world habits. This created a gap between generations within the mob. Older members like Michele still spoke Italian, kept ties to Italy, and thought of themselves as Italian. Younger members were completely American, often barely able to speak Italian, and saw the old ways as outdated. Michele was a link between these generations. He was born in Italy, raised with old world values. But he had lived most of his life in America and understood American culture. He could speak both languages, in words and in understanding. This made him valuable as a go-between and advisor. When the war ended in 1945, America entered a time of great wealth. The GI Bill, growth in the suburbs, and the economy created the largest middle class in history. For the mob, this meant more chances. More people with more money meant more gambling, more building, more of everything the mob controlled. But 1946 brought a huge change. Lucky Luciano was released from prison and immediately sent back to Italy. Luciano being sent away was a disaster for the mob, and especially for his family. He was only 59 years old and would have been active for at least another 10 or 20 years if he had stayed in America. Instead, he was forced to live in Italy, from where he could still have some influence, but could not directly manage operations. The family was now firmly in Frank Costello's hands. Vito Genovese was still in Italy, having run away from murder charges in 1937. With both Luciano and Genovese out of the country, Costello had complete freedom to run the family as he saw fit. For Michele, now 50 years old, this was the start of his rise to the very top of the group. Costello needed experienced senior captains who could manage major operations and give good advice. Michele was perfect for this job. He had proven himself over 25 years in the life. He ran a profitable area. He avoided problems. He gave good advice. He was exactly what Costello needed. The years after the war, 1946 to 1950, were maybe the most profitable in the American Mafia's history. The families were making money from every angle. Gambling, taking money from unions, stealing shipments, loan sharking, and more legal businesses that mob money had gotten into. The commission was working well, keeping peace between families and cities. Police were manageable through bribes and good lawyers. Michele's operations in East Harlem continued to be where his power came from, but his influence now reached far beyond his neighborhood. He was asked for his opinion on family decisions. He helped settle arguments. He represented the family in commission matters. He was becoming what would later be called consigliere, the counselor, the advisor, the wise older statesman. But problems were coming. In 1946, Vito Genovese came back to America. The murder charge he had run from had been dropped after a key witness was killed, supposedly by Genovese's associates, though this was never proven. Genovese was free and hungry for power. He wanted back what he thought was rightfully his. Leadership of the family that had Luciano's name, but which Genovese believed should be his. The stage was set for a fight for power that would define the next 10 years and test Michele Miranda's skills at talking and negotiating to their limits. Vito Genovese came back to America in 1946 with murder in his heart. Not random murder, but carefully planned political murder designed to get back what he believed was his rightful place at the top of the family. Genovese was different from Frank Costello in almost every way. Costello was a diplomat, preferring to make money through political connections and smart operations. Genovese was violent, believing that power came from fear and that respect was earned by being ruthless. Costello avoided attention. Genovese wanted to be noticed. Costello thought long-term. Genovese wanted results right away. For the next 11 years, from 1946 to 1957, these two men would have a cold war for control of the family, and Michele Miranda would be right in the middle. Michele had worked closely with Costello for years and respected him a lot. They had the same temperament and the same ideas about how organized crime should work. But Michele had also known Genovese since the 1930s and could not just ignore him. Genovese was underboss after all, and had been loyal to Luciano during the important years. He had connections, support, and a willingness to use violence that made him dangerous to go against. Michele's way of dealing with this problem was typical of him. He stayed loyal to both men without fully committing to either. He kept running his operations, making money, and giving advice when asked. He did not take sides in their arguments. He kept relationships with supporters of both groups. He was Switzerland in a brewing civil war. This was not cowardice. It was how you survived in mob politics. Choosing a side too early or too strongly could get you killed. If you backed the loser, you were gotten rid of. If you backed the winner too strongly, you might be seen as a threat later. The safest path was to be valuable to everyone while being a threat to no one. The 1940s and early 1950s saw Costello at the height of his power. He had connections to politicians at every level, from local judges to senators. He controlled gambling operations across the country, especially in New Orleans and Florida. He invested in legal businesses, including hotels and casinos. He was the mob's representative to the outside world, the man who could pick up a phone and reach anyone. Under Costello's leadership, the family did very well. Michele's position kept rising. By the early 1950s, he was widely seen as one of the family's top leaders. A capo di tutti capi, a captain above other captains. His advice was asked on big decisions. His opinion mattered at commission meetings. He was in effect Costello's consigliere, though the title may not have been official yet. But Genovese was patient and clever. He could not move against Costello directly. Costello had too much support, too many connections, too much respect. Instead, Genovese worked carefully to weaken Costello's position and build his own power base. First, Genovese strengthened his relationships with other bosses. He got close to Carlo Gambino, the ambitious underboss of the Mangano family, who had his own plans for leadership. He built ties with the Lucchese and Colombo families. He made himself useful to Luciano, who was living in Italy, but still commanded respect. Second, Genovese presented himself as the keeper of traditional mob values. He criticized Costello's ties to politicians as making the family weak. He complained that Costello was too focused on gambling and not enough on more traditional rackets. He suggested that Costello had become soft, too willing to compromise, not Italian enough. This was planned. The 1950s were seeing more and more police pressure on organized crime. Senator Estes Kefauver's special committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, which worked from 1950 to 1951, had televised hearings that showed mob operations to the American public. Frank Costello was called to testify, and though the camera only showed his hands, it was embarrassing. The mob was supposed to work in secret, and here was its leader on national television. The Kefauver hearings hurt Costello's reputation within the mob. He had promised that his political connections would protect the family from serious investigation. But here he was being questioned by senators while America watched. Genovese used this, arguing that Costello's way of doing things had failed. Michele watched all of this with growing worry. He understood that the Costello-Genovese fight could not go on forever. Eventually, one would move against the other. And when that happened, everyone would have to pick a side. Michele was almost 60 years old. He had survived everything the mob world had thrown at him for nearly 40 years. He did not want to end his life in a gang war over someone else's ambition. A crisis came on May 2nd, 1957. Frank Costello was coming back to his apartment building at the Majestic on Central Park West. As he walked into the lobby, a gunman, later identified as Vincent the Chin Gigante, came up and fired a shot that grazed Costello's head. Costello survived, but the message was clear. Genovese wanted him out. In the days after the shooting, Costello made a decision. Rather than fight a war he might not win, he would step aside. He retired, formally, if not actually, giving Genovese what he wanted: recognition as boss of the family. This was a moment of truth for Michele. Genovese had won, but through violence and fear rather than agreement. Many in the family respected Costello and did not like Genovese's methods. But Genovese was now the official boss, and he would expect loyalty. Michele did what he had always done. He adjusted. He kept his relationship with Costello, who stayed influential even in retirement. But he also promised loyalty to Genovese and kept running his operations. He was too valuable to get rid of. His area made money. His operations ran smoothly. His advice was smart, and his reputation was perfect. Genovese made Michele his consigliere, making official the advising role Michele had been playing for years. This was a great honor, but also a dangerous position. The consigliere was supposed to give neutral advice and settle arguments. But in a family with as many tensions as the Genovese family in 1957, that neutrality was almost impossible to keep. Genovese was now without question boss of the family, but he wanted more. He wanted recognition from the other families as the main power on the commission. He wanted the respect that had been given to Luciano. He wanted, though he would never admit it, to be something like boss of bosses. To do this, Genovese called a meeting, a gathering of top mobsters from across the country, a meeting that would show his power and authority, a meeting that would become one of the biggest disasters in mob history. The Appalachian meeting, November 14th, 1957. Michele Miranda dressed carefully that morning. At 61 years old, he had been in the mob for nearly 40 years. He had survived the Castellammarese War, the Luciano trials, World War II, and the Costello-Genovese fight. He had seen hundreds of men die violently. He had been to countless meetings, from small sit-downs in social clubs to commission gatherings in fancy restaurants. But he had never been to anything like what was planned for that day in Appalachian, New York. The meeting had been called by Vito Genovese, supposedly to talk about several topics. welcoming new members, discussing arguments over territory, and coordinating operations between families. The real reason, everyone understood, was for Genovese to get public recognition of his position as boss of the most powerful family in New York, and, by extension, the most powerful boss in the country. The place was the home of Joseph Joe, the Barber Barbara, and Appalachian, a small town in upstate New York near the Pennsylvania border. Barbara was a capo in the Buffalo family and had hosted smaller mob meetings before. His property was isolated, surrounded by hills and forests. Seemingly perfect for a secret gathering, Michele did not want to go. He was old enough and wise enough to recognize a mistake in the making. Gathering 60-plus top mobsters in one place was always risky, even in a rural area. That many expensive cars and well-dressed men would attract attention, and the timing was terrible. Police pressure was increasing after the Kefauver hearings, and any big gathering was a chance for police, but refusing to go was not an option. Genovese had made clear that coming was expected. Missing the meeting would be seen as disrespect or worse, disloyalty. So Michele went along with other top members of the Genovese family. They arrived at Barbara's property in the morning. The place was big, a large stone house, several smaller buildings, lots of land. Cars were parked everywhere. Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chryslers, all with license plates from different states. New York was heavily represented, but there were also cars from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, California, Florida, and Illinois. Inside, the meeting began. About 100 men gathered in Barbara's house discussing business. The exact list of topics is not clear. No notes were taken, and most of the people there refused to talk about what was said. But we know some things were talked about. The drug trade was discussed. This was a point of disagreement. The old school bosses, including Michele, were generally against drug dealing. It attracted too much police attention. The prison sentences were too harsh, and it went against certain traditional rules. But younger members and some bosses saw the profits as too big to ignore. Genovese himself would later be found guilty of drug dealing, suggesting he was in the second group. Arguments over territory needed to be settled. With Costello retired and Albert Anastasia recently murdered, likely ordered by Genovese and Carlo Gambino, the New York families were sharing out power and operations. New members needed official recognition. Several men had recently been made, and the commission usually confirmed big promotions, but they never got to finish their business. Outside, New York State Police Sergeant Edgar D. Crosswell had noticed the unusual activity. Crosswell was no fool. He had been watching Barbara for years, suspecting he was involved in organized crime, when he saw the line of expensive cars, the out-of-state plates, and the well-dressed visitors. He knew something big was happening. Crosswell set up roadblocks and called for more officers. Then, with a small team of troopers, he walked toward the house. When word reached the mobsters inside that police were outside, panic broke out. These were men who commanded fear and respect in their own areas, who had faced violence and danger their whole lives, who thought they were above the law. But faced with actual police, they ran. Some ran into the nearby woods, their expensive suits ruined by mud and branches. Some tried to hide in the house. Some claimed to be innocent visitors who just happened to be there. It was chaos, embarrassing chaos. For men who were proud of keeping their dignity and respect, Michele did not run. At 61, he was too old and dignified for that. He walked to his car, calm, and got ready to leave properly. But the roadblocks were already in place. He was stopped, questioned, and held along with dozens of others. In the end, 58 men were identified and arrested. The list was amazing: bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, and capos from families across the country. The police had accidentally found the largest gathering of top mobsters in American history. The immediate results were fairly small. No one was charged with serious crimes. How could they be? Meeting with other Italian men was not illegal. Most of those caught said they were visiting Barbara, who was sick and had no idea other visitors would be there. It was ridiculous, but impossible to prove in court. But the long-term results were terrible for the mob. First, the American public now had proof that organized crime existed on a national scale. The mob could no longer hide behind claims of being just local street gangs. The Appalachian meeting showed organization, coordination, and national reach. Second, Congress responded with new investigations. The McClellan Committee, led by Senator John McClellan with counsel Robert Kennedy, started aggressive investigations into organized crime and union corruption. Many of the men arrested at Appalachian were called to testify. Michele was among them. Michele's testimony before the McClellan Committee was a perfect example of saying nothing. He used the Fifth Amendment over and over, refusing to answer almost every question. This was normal for mobsters, but it looked bad publicly. Americans watching the televised hearings saw rich, well-dressed men refusing to explain how they made their money or why they were meeting with known criminals. For Michele personally, Appalachian marked him permanently in police files. He had always been known to police as a mobster, but now he was documented as a high-ranking member of a national criminal group. FBI surveillance increased. IRS checks got more intense. His picture appeared in newspapers and magazines. But maybe the worst result was inside the mob. Many members blamed Genovese for the disaster. The meeting had been his idea, his way of showing power. Instead, it had exposed everyone to never-before-seen police attention. It had embarrassed the most powerful men in the underworld, and it had achieved nothing except bad outcomes. Michele, always diplomatic, did not publicly criticize Genovese, but privately he must have been furious. His whole career had been based on staying in the shadows, avoiding attention, operating quietly. Appalachian had ruined that. At 61, when he should have been slowing down toward retirement, he was now more exposed than ever. The old ways of operating were ending. The mob would never again be able to claim it did not exist, and the pressure from police would only increase. Within 2 years, Vito Genovese would be in prison, found guilty on drug charges, and Michele would face another change in leadership, another test of his ability to survive. After the Appalachian disaster, Vito Genovese's position was shaky. He had achieved his goal of becoming recognized boss, but at the cost of exposing the whole organization to never-before-seen police attention. He needed a win, something to show he was still powerful and in control. Instead, he made the mistake that would end his career. Large-scale heroin dealing. The argument over drug dealing had been going on in the mob since at least the 1950s. The reasons against were strong. Drug sentences were extremely harsh, often life in prison. Drug users were not reliable and drew police attention. And there was a moral part that even hardened criminals sometimes respected. The commission had officially banned drug dealing among MAID members, though it was not always enforced, but the money was amazing. Heroin especially offered profits that were bigger than even gambling and union rackets. A $5,000 investment in heroin could bring back $100,000 or more on the street. The temptation was huge. Genovese, whether personally involved or through men under him, got into the heroin business. This went against the commission's rules and his own past statements against drugs. But Genovese believed he was too powerful to face consequences. Michele, as consigliere, reportedly advised against this path. He understood that drug dealing was a losing idea in the long run, even if you made money at first. The risk of informers was high because people charged with drug crimes faced such long sentences that they often helped the police to get their time reduced. And federal police, especially the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger, were aggressive and had plenty of money. But Genovese did not listen. He believed in his own power. He was sure he could operate without being caught. He was wrong. In 1958, federal police began building a case against Genovese. Their main witness was Nelson Cantaloupes, a Puerto Rican drug dealer who claimed to have worked for Genovese's organization. Cantaloupes' story was questionable. He was a drug addict and dealer with every reason to lie in exchange for a shorter sentence. But other evidence and testimony from other witnesses supported his claims. In July 1958, Genovese and 23 others were charged with federal drug crimes. The trial began in early 1959 and lasted several weeks. The prosecution showed evidence of a large-scale heroin operation, bringing drugs from Italy through Mexico into New York. Genovese said he was innocent, claiming he was being set up by ambitious federal prosecutors. This may have been partly true. There is evidence that some witnesses lied or made things sound worse. But there is also a lot of evidence that Genovese was in fact involved in drug dealing. On April 4, 1959, Vito Genovese was found guilty on drug charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, basically a life sentence for a man in his 60s. He would die in prison in 1969, never having been released. For Michele Miranda, this was like before. Once again, the boss he served was removed from power. First Luciano in 1936, then Costello forced into retirement in 1957. Now Genovese found guilty in 1959. Each time Michele survived and adjusted, but this change was different. Luciano had chosen Costello to replace him. Costello had chosen to step aside for Genovese. But Genovese went to prison without clearly naming someone to take over. This created an empty space at the top and a possible fight over who would be the next boss. Several men could have claimed the boss position: Jerry Katina, Michele Miranda himself, or others. But instead of another destructive fight for power, the family came up with a new solution: a ruling group. Instead of naming one boss who might become another Genovese, several top members would together run the family. This group included Michele as consigliere, along with other senior leaders. Decisions would be made together. Power would be shared. The goal was stability after 10 years of turmoil. Michele, now 63 years old, was at the center of this plan. His role as consigliere became more important than ever. He was the voice of experience, the man who had seen it all, the older statesman whose advice everyone wanted. But the damage from Appalachian and Genovese's drug conviction was done. The FBI was now fully fighting the mob. J. Edgar Hoover, who had for a long time denied that organized crime even existed, was now sending huge resources toward destroying it. The McClellan Committee's investigations had provided a map, and Robert Kennedy, who had been the main lawyer for the committee, was now Attorney General under his brother, President John F. Kennedy. The 1960s would be a decade of pressure, surveillance, and prosecutions, and Michele would need every bit of his gathered wisdom and survival skills to get through it. Michele Miranda entered the 1960s as a man in his mid-60s, an age when most men were retiring to spend time with grandchildren. But in the mob, retirement was not an option. You were in for life, which usually meant until your life ended violently. Michele surviving to this age was already amazing. The 1960s brought never-before-seen pressure on organized crime. The Kennedy administration made fighting the mob a priority. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, used every tool available. Electronic eavesdropping, witness protection programs to encourage informers, IRS investigations, and federal laws against organized crime. The FBI, which had for a long time focused on communist plots, now turned its attention to the Mafia. The family that Vito Genovese had left behind was now run by a committee. Thomas E. Boley emerged as a front boss, but real power was shared among several top members. Including Michele, this setup worked reasonably well. Decisions were slower, but more carefully considered, and there was no single person for police to focus on. Michele's operations in Lower Manhattan and the Garment District continued. He was now a part of the neighborhood, having run illegal gambling and other rackets there for over 40 years. Young gangsters who worked for him had not been born when he started in the mob. Old-timers who remembered the Castellammarese War were dying off, and Michele was one of the few left who was still alive from that time. His legal businesses provided cover and legal money. He paid his taxes, kept a respectable public image, and avoided obvious displays of wealth that might attract IRS attention. His home was comfortable, but not a mansion. His cars were nice, but not showy. He presented himself as a successful businessman from the old country who had done well in America, which was true, just not in the way he suggested. But the watching was constant. FBI agents followed him regularly. His phones were probably tapped. His visitors were photographed. His financial records were checked closely. The government was building files, looking for any opening to bring charges. Michele's strategy was what it had always been. Be careful, stay clean, and give them nothing. He did not talk about business on phones. He had sensitive conversations in moving cars or while walking. Making following more difficult, he kept his legal businesses in perfect order, making sure his tax returns would stand up to inspection. And he kept advising younger members to be smart, be patient, and avoid unnecessary risks. The changing world of organized crime was clear in many ways. The old barriers between ethnic groups were breaking down. The families worked more and more with non-Italians when it was profitable. The strict rules of the old days were disappearing. More members were informing to save themselves from long prison sentences. The FBI's use of electronic eavesdropping was catching conversations that would have been safe in the past. Michele represented the old school, the traditional values, the ways that had worked for decades. He believed in omerta, complete silence about family business. He believed in showing respect to those above you and demanding it from those below you. He believed that violence should be planned, not done out of anger. He believed in keeping honor, even in a dishonorable business. But he also understood that times were changing, and that the mob had to change or die. The young gangsters coming up in the 1960s were different from his generation. They were born in America, often second or third generation. They did not speak Italian. They had not experienced the poverty that had driven their fathers and grandfathers into crime. They were more careless, more violent, less strategic. Michele tried to guide some of these younger men, teaching them the old ways, but it was harder and harder. The new generation saw the old-timers as dinosaurs, out of touch with modern times. They wanted to make big scores quickly, rather than building operations that would last. They used drugs themselves, even though the mob officially banned them. They talked too much, trusted too easily, and attracted attention for no reason. This gap between generations was creating tension within the families. The old-timers controlled the power structure, and were not ready to give it up. The young ones were impatient and felt they could run things better. Fights broke out, sometimes violent ones. Michele's age and experience made him valuable as a go-between. When arguments happened between groups, he was one of the few men respected by all sides. He could sit down with angry young soldiers and convince them to be patient. He could advise aging capos to give younger members more responsibility. He could speak the language of both generations, in words and in understanding. His relationship with other family bosses stayed strong. Carlo Gambino, who had become boss of his family in 1957, often asked for Michele's advice even though they were from different families. They had mutual respect built over decades. Tommy Lucchese, until his death in 1967, was another old friend, Joe Bonato, before he was forced to retire, talked with Michele about commission matters. These relationships were important because the commission still worked as organized crime's board of directors. Big decisions, arguments over territory, approval of murders, changes in policy, were still brought to the commission, and Michele, as consigliere of the Genovese family and one of the commission's senior statesmen, had a lot of influence, but the commission itself was under attack. Police were finding out about it, identifying its members, and building cases that would eventually allow prosecution of whole organizations rather than individual crimes. The days when mob bosses could operate openly, living in known houses and meeting in public restaurants, were ending. Michele adjusted by becoming even more careful. He limited his public activities. He made his profile even lower. He worked more and more through go-betweens. At an age when most men were grandparents, relaxing into retirement, Michele was still actively managing criminal operations, settling arguments, and trying to protect an organization under attack from federal police. The stress must have been huge. Every phone call might be listened to. Every visitor might be an informer. Every meeting might be photographed. The suspicion that had always been part of mob life got worse. Trust became even more rare and valuable. Yet Michele kept going. He had made a choice decades earlier to live this life, and he was determined to see it through. He had wealth, respect, and power, the things he had wanted when he left poverty in Italy. But the price was always being watchful, being separate, and knowing that it could all end in prison or violence at any moment. His family life gave him some peace. His wife, children, and grandchildren gave him a connection to normal life. They lived comfortably with his money. And if they suspected or knew where that money came from, they kept the traditional silence. Family meals, holidays, grandchildren's achievements. These were the moments when Michele could stop being a mob consigliere and just be Michele Miranda, grandfather and head of the family. But he could never fully stop. The life he had chosen did not allow for retirement or peace. It demanded everything until the very end. As the 1960s came to a close, Michele was almost 70. He had survived longer than almost anyone else from his generation. The people he had known in the 1920s and 1930s were nearly all dead. Most died violently. Lucky Luciano had died in 1962 at Naples Airport, apparently of a heart attack. Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969. Frank Costello, who had survived his shooting in 1957, was retired and would die peacefully in 1973. Carlo Gambino was still active, but he was younger than Michele. Michele had achieved what seemed impossible in the mob. He was growing old, and he had done it while staying active, respected and powerful. He had gotten through every crisis, survived every fight for power, adjusted to every change. His formula for success: intelligence over violence, patience over recklessness, loyalty without going too far, had worked. But the 1970s would bring new challenges, and Michele's amazing run was entering its final part. By 1970, Michele Miranda was 74 years old. In the mob, this was ancient. Most gangsters never saw 60, let alone 70. But Michele was not only alive, he was still active, still asked for advice, still influential. The Genovese family in the early 1970s was operating under Frank Thierry as front boss, with power still shared among a ruling group that included Michele. This setup had worked reasonably well through the 1960s, providing stability while avoiding the problems of having one all-powerful boss who might become another Genovese. But the family, like all the families, was changing. The new generation of members was different from Michele's generation. In almost every way, they were born and raised in America, with no memory of Italy or the immigrant struggle. To them, the old country was at best a vague homeland of their ancestors. Not a real memory. They spoke English as their first and often only language. They had grown up in relative comfort, not the crushing poverty that had defined Michele's youth. They had gone to better schools, had more chances, and expected things to happen faster. Their approach to the mob life showed these differences. Where Michele's generation had been patient, building operations slowly and carefully, the new generation wanted quick money. Where the old-timers had avoided drugs on principle, many younger members saw the drug trade as too profitable to ignore, and some used drugs themselves. Where the traditional code demanded silence under all circumstances, younger members were more willing to help the police to avoid long sentences. Michele watched these changes with worry, but also understanding. He understood that each generation was shaped by its own times. His generation had been shaped by poverty, coming to America, and prohibition. The new generation was shaped by comfort, civil rights movements, and the drug culture of the 1960s. They were products of their time, just as he had been. But he also understood that some traditional values were being lost in this change, and those values had been very important to the mob's success. Omerta, the code of silence, had been absolute for his generation. You never helped the police, no matter what. Going to prison was part of the job, and you did your time without complaining or informing. But younger members facing decades in prison under harsh sentencing rules were more and more deciding that saving themselves was more important than tradition. This breaking down of Omerta worried Michele deeply. The mob's power had always rested on two things: its willingness to use violence against its enemies, and its members' refusal to testify against each other. Violence alone was not enough. Plenty of criminal gangs were violent, but got crushed by police because members informed. The mob had survived because it combined violence with an iron rule of silence. But if that rule was breaking, the mob's survival was at risk. Michele tried to guide younger members when he could. He would tell stories from the old days, explaining how things were done and why. He would advise patience and caution. He would stress the importance of honor and loyalty. Sometimes young gangsters listened respectfully. Michele's reputation demanded respect. Sometimes they listened, but did not really hear, seeing him as an old man out of touch with modern realities. The irony was that Michele's approach, intelligence over violence, careful planning over reckless action, long-term thinking over short-term gains, was more relevant than ever in a time of advanced surveillance and aggressive prosecution. But the younger generation often learned this too late, after they were already in prison or dead. Michele's role in these years became more and more about advising rather than running things. He still controlled his area in East Harlem, but day-to-day operations were handled by men under him. He went to important meetings and was asked for his opinion on big decisions, but he was no longer managing every detail. This was natural. At 70-plus years old, he no longer had the energy for 18-hour days and constant crisis management. But his advice was still valued when serious arguments came up. Michele was often asked to help settle them. His decades of experience gave him perspective that younger bosses lacked. He had seen fights for power before and knew how they could turn into destructive wars. He had seen the results of bad decisions and could warn against repeating past mistakes. He had relationships across families that made him valuable in commission business. His legendary status within the organization grew during this time. To younger members, Michele Miranda was living history. He had known Lucky Luciano personally. He had been there when the commission was created. He had survived the Castellammarese War, Prohibition, World War II, the Kefauver hearings, Appalachian, and everything else. He was the living link to the past of the organization. Stories went around about Michele, some true, some exaggerated, some made up. He was said to have been at famous murders, to have wealth hidden in multiple countries, to have connections to Italian politicians and business leaders. How much was true? How much was legend? Even Michele probably could not completely separate them. But the respect was real. In the mob's culture, age and survival commanded respect. Michele had earned his position through decades of good work. He had made money for his bosses. He had given good advice. He had stayed loyal through multiple changes in leadership. He had avoided prison when others fell. These achievements made him a model, someone younger members should want to be like. His relationship with Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino family, was especially important during this time. Gambino, though younger than Michele, was also from the old school, cautious, strategic. Against unnecessary violence, the two men had known each other for decades and shared a similar way of thinking about how the mob should operate. They talked regularly about commission business and family matters. In a world of betrayal and suspicion, they had as close to a friendship as was possible in their business. But even Gambino was feeling the pressure. His family, like all families, was under intense FBI watching. Electronic eavesdropping was catching conversations that would have been safe in earlier times. Younger members were being turned into informers. The RICO laws passed in 1970 gave prosecutors powerful new tools to go after whole organizations rather than individual crimes. Michele and Gambino talked about these challenges, trying to adjust old methods to new threats. But there were limits to what they could do. The basic way of doing business, running illegal enterprises through structured criminal groups, made them open to RICO prosecutions. The technology, hidden microphones, wiretaps, long-range photography, made traditional security methods not good enough. And the breaking down of omerta meant that even trusted members might help the police. The mob would survive into the 21st century, but its best years were ending. The 1970s would see more and more prosecutions, more informers, and the start of the decline. It would speed up in the 1980s and 1990s. Michele would not live to see most of this, but he sensed which way things were moving. In his mid-70s, Michele was slowing down physically. The years were catching up with him. He still had his mental sharpness. His mind stayed quick, but his body was aging. He moved more slowly, got tired more easily, dealt with the aches and pains that come with age. He started thinking about what he would leave behind. What would he leave? Wealth, certainly. He had gathered a lot of money over 50 years in the mob, family, children, and grandchildren who would live comfortable lives because of his work, reputation within the organization. He would be remembered as one of the greats, a man who survived everything and died free. But he had no illusions about the kind of legacy he had. He was a criminal who had made money from gambling, violence, and taking advantage of people. He had hurt people directly or indirectly. The wealth he had gathered came from operations that damaged communities. Whatever good he might have done, supporting his family, helping other Italian immigrants, keeping order in his area, could not erase the harm. Yet Michele lived in a different moral world than most Americans. In his view of the world, everyone was trying to get ahead. Everyone was working the system. Everyone was taking advantage of chances. The mob was more honest than politicians who pretended to be legal while being just as crooked. The gamblers and loan shark customers made choices to be in illegal activities. The people the mob took advantage of, in his view, would have been taken advantage of by someone else if the mob did not exist. This way of thinking let Michele live with himself and what he had done, whether he really believed it or whether it was a comforting lie he told himself. Only he knew, but it helped him through his final years. In 1973, Michele Miranda was 77 years old. He had lived longer than almost anyone in the mob, had gathered more wealth than most, and had ended up more powerful than he started. By any measure except moral ones, he had been extremely successful. And then in July 1973, in a way almost never seen for someone in his position, Michele Miranda died peacefully of natural causes in his own bed. Surrounded by family, July 1973, Queens, New York. Michele Miranda lay in his bed, his body finally failing after 77 years of life. 50 plus of those years spent in one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. The exact date and details of his death are not widely recorded. Typically, Michele left this world as quietly as he had moved through it. But we know he died at home of natural causes, with family present, for a mob boss. This was the rarest of endings. Think about what this means. Michele had entered the American underworld around 1920. During Prohibition, he had worked under Joe Masiria, one of the most violent bosses of the early time. He had survived the Castellamarese War, when dozens of gangsters were murdered. He had been a made member during the most violent period of American organized crime. He had known hundreds of mobsters personally. Most of them died violently. Shot in the street, attacked in restaurants, strangled, stabbed, blown up, found in car trunks. Dying in prison was considered lucky compared to these fates. But dying peacefully at home at age 77 after a long and profitable career, this was almost a miracle. How did Michele do this? How did he survive when others like Joe Masiria, Salvatore Maranzano, Albert Anastasia, and dozens of others ended up murdered? How did he avoid the long prison sentences that caught Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and many others? The answer is in the same qualities that had defined his whole career: intelligence, patience, diplomacy, and restraint. Michele was never the most powerful boss or the richest gangster. He was never the most feared or the most violent. He did not seek attention or want recognition. He did not need to be boss of bosses or even boss of his own family. What he wanted and achieved was to do well, survive and die free. This required always being careful. Michele never stopped being cautious, even in his 70s. He kept security measures, watched what he said, and avoided giving police or rivals any opening. This constant watchfulness kept him alive. It required political skill. Michele got through multiple changes in leadership by being valuable to all sides while being a threat to none. He gave loyalty without becoming so tied to any boss that he would fall when that boss fell. He built relationships across families and generations. It required knowing when violence was needed and when it was not helpful. Michele was willing to kill when necessary. You could not survive in the mob without that willingness, but he did not kill without need. He did not see violence as the first choice or a way to solve every problem. This restraint made him less likely to create blood feuds or attract police attention, and it required staying away from certain activities. Michele apparently avoided drug dealing, even though the profits were huge. He understood that drugs attracted a lot of police attention, and that people charged with drug crimes were more likely to inform. This decision cost him money, but probably kept him out of prison in his final years. Michele's life was probably quiet. He had earned the right to step back from daily operations. He spent time with family, his wife, children, grandchildren. He went to family dinners, holidays, celebrations, to his family. He was just Grandpa Michele, a successful businessman who had done well in America. But he was never fully separate from the life. Phone calls still came asking for his advice. Visitors still came to show respect and ask for guidance. FBI agents still followed him sometimes. He was retired in the sense that he was not actively managing operations, but he stayed connected and influential. His funeral, when it came in July 1973, was a big event in the underworld. Hundreds attended, family, friends, associates, and mob figures from across New York and beyond. FBI agents watched and took pictures of those who came, adding to their files on organized crime. Newspapers noted the passing of a known organized crime figure, but the full story of Michele's life remained mostly unknown to the public. He was buried with the respect due to an older statesman. Fellow mobsters spoke of his wisdom, his fairness, his honor. Family members mourned a husband, father, and grandfather. The priest who did the service probably knew Michele's profession, but gave the Catholic rites anyway. The church had a complicated relationship with Italian organized crime, speaking against it publicly, while often looking the other way in practice. What Michele left behind was substantial. His estate included legal businesses, real estate, investments, and probably cash and assets hidden from tax authorities. His family was taken care of. His children could live comfortable, legal lives without going into the criminal world. His grandchildren would grow up with chances he never had as a boy near Vesuvius. He left behind a reputation within the mob as one of the smartest and most successful operators of his generation. Younger gangsters would hear stories about Big Mike Miranda for years after his death. How he survived everything, how he gave good advice, how he died peacefully when so many others died violently. But he also left behind questions without answers. How much money had he really gathered over 5 decades? Who had he killed or ordered killed? What secrets did he take with him? What deals had he made? What betrayals had he seen? What compromises had he accepted? Michele Miranda never wrote a book about his life. He never talked to reporters. He never testified truthfully about his life in organized crime. The Fifth Amendment was his shield before congressional committees. Omerta was his promise to fellow mobsters. Silence was his way of surviving. This silence makes it hard for historians, but was necessary for Michele's success. Talking got you killed or imprisoned. Writing things down created evidence. Boasting attracted attention. The quietest ones lasted the longest, and Michele had been very quiet indeed. His death marked the end of an era in some ways. He was one of the last living links to the Castellamarese War and the creation of the Commission. He had known Lucky Luciano personally, had worked under the famous bosses. had seen the mob's rise from prohibition street gangs to complex criminal businesses. The mob would continue after Michele's death. Of course, the Genovese family stayed powerful. The commission still worked. Organized crime changed and survived. But something had been lost, the connection to the founding generation. The memory of how and why things were done certain ways. The wisdom that only comes from decades of experience. Carlo Gambino, who lived 3 years longer than Michele, was one of the few old-timers left at Michele's level. When Gambino died in 1976, also of natural causes at home, another link to the past was gone. The new generation of bosses, men like Paul Castellano, John Gotti, and others, would run the families differently, often more flashy, usually less successfully. Michele's approach, quiet, patient, strategic, became harder and harder to find. The mob's decline in the 1980s and beyond was partly because of police pressure, but it was also because of the loss of the wisdom that men like Michele had shown. The new bosses made mistakes the old-timers would not have made. They talked on phones that were tapped. They trusted people who became informers. They sought attention that attracted police. If Michele could have seen the future, the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s, the flood of informers, the imprisonment of boss after boss, the rise of cooperating witnesses like Sammy Gravano, he might have thought his timing was perfect. He had lived through the mob's best years and died before the decline became impossible to stop. But maybe he did see it coming, maybe in his final years. Watching younger members ignore the old rules, seeing omerta weaken, understanding that technology was making traditional security methods not good enough. Michele understood that the end was coming. Maybe he was grateful to have lived his full life before the fall. What made Michele Miranda successful when so many others failed? What plan allowed him to survive for over 50 years in a business where most men died before 40? What can we learn from his life about power, survival, and success in a world of violence and betrayal? Michele was not the most violent gangster of his time. He did not build his reputation on being the toughest guy in the neighborhood or the fastest to pull a trigger. He was certainly willing to use violence when necessary. You could not survive in the mob without that willingness. But he understood that violence was a tool to be used carefully, not emotionally. This set him apart from others who saw violence as the first choice. Many gangsters built their reputations on being feared, on being so violent that others would not dare cross them. But that approach had serious problems. It created enemies who wanted revenge. It attracted police attention. And it meant you could always be replaced by someone even more violent. Michele built his reputation on being smart, reliable, and good at talking. When arguments came up, he looked for solutions that made everyone happy, rather than insisting on total victory. When violence was needed, he made sure it was carefully planned and done, not emotional and messy. This approach made him valuable to bosses who needed problems solved intelligently. Michele served under multiple bosses: Joe Miseria, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese. And the ruling groups that came after, each change could have been deadly. Many gangsters died for being too close to bosses who fell from power. But Michele survived every change because he was loyal to the organization and its rules, not just to individual leaders. He understood that bosses came and went. Power was temporary. Today's boss might be tomorrow's corpse or prisoner, but the organization continued. So Michele built relationships across the leadership, making himself valuable to all groups while fully committing to none. This was not betrayal. It was survival through political understanding. When Costello and Genovese fought for control, Michele kept relationships with both. When Genovese went to prison, Michele adjusted to the new leaders. His loyalty was to the family as an institution, and this let him survive individual power struggles. Michele apparently avoided drug dealing. Even though the profits were huge, this decision was partly moral. He came from a generation that saw drug dealing as beneath them, but it was also smart planning. Drug cases attracted a lot of police attention. Drug sentences were harsh, and people facing decades in prison for drugs were more likely to inform. By staying away from drugs, Michele avoided the trap that caught Vito Genovese and many others. He made less money than he might have, but he also avoided the risk that came with drug operations. This restraint required discipline, saying no to profitable chances because they were too risky. More broadly, Michele kept a fairly clean profile. He paid taxes on his legal income. He avoided obvious displays of wealth that might attract IRS attention. He kept his operations quiet and professional. When arrested, he faced small charges that usually did not result in much prison time. This approach required patience. It meant building wealth slowly through operations that would last rather than taking huge risks for big, quick money. But it worked. Michele died wealthy and free. While flashier gangsters died young or in prison, Michele was never the public face of organized crime. He did not seek publicity. He did not build relationships with celebrities or reporters. He did not live like a movie star. He operated in the shadows, which was exactly where a successful gangster should operate. This was different from gangsters like John Gotti, who decades later would welcome publicity and fame. Gotti became famous, appeared on magazine covers, and lived flashy. He also died in prison. The connection is not a coincidence. Being well known attracts police attention and public pressure for prosecution. Michele understood that real power does not need publicity. The most powerful people in any organization, legal or criminal, often are not the ones with the highest public profiles. They are the ones making decisions, controlling resources, and having influence behind the scenes. Michele was happy with this role. His intelligence was clear in how he ran his operations. He was organized, disciplined, and strategic. He thought long-term, building operations that would last rather than just going after immediate profits. He handled people well, creating loyalty through respect rather than just fear. He understood business basics that many gangsters ignored. Michele showed certain traditional values. Even while doing criminal activities, he kept his word. When he made an agreement, he stuck to it. When he took on a responsibility, he completed it. This dependability made him someone you could trust in a world where trust was rare and valuable. He also showed respect where respect was due. He showed proper respect to those above him. He treated those at his level with courtesy. He was generous to those below him who served him well. This was not weakness. It was understanding that organizations run on relationships, and relationships need mutual respect. His code of silence, omerta, was complete. He never helped the police, never testified against fellow mobsters, never broke the basic rule of the life. This made him someone his associates could trust and created a reputation that protected him. But Michele's success came at a cost. He lived always in danger, knowing that any day could bring betrayal, violence, or arrest. He could never fully trust anyone. Even close associates might be informers or rivals. His relationships with family were necessarily complicated by his criminal activities, and he spent his whole adult life watching over his shoulder, being careful what he said and staying alert. He also made money from activities that hurt others. His gambling operations took money from people who could not afford to lose it. His loan-sharking operations trapped people in debt. His union rackets took advantage of workers and employers. His violence, when used, destroyed lives. Whatever good he might have done, supporting his family, helping other Italian immigrants, could not erase this harm. The question Michele's life raises is uncomfortable. Can we call a criminal's life successful if he gains wealth, power, and a long life through illegal means? Does surviving and doing well in an evil business count as success? Or does it just make you a successful evil person? Michele would probably have argued that everyone was crooked, that the difference between criminal and legal was not real, and that he was just smarter about going after wealth and power than people who pretended to be honest. But this is a way to make himself feel better. The harm Michele caused was real, even if he convinced himself it was not. Michele Miranda's effect on American organized crime was large but not obvious. He was not someone with new ideas like Lucky Luciano or a political genius like Frank Costello. He did not create new rackets or change how the mob operated. What he did was perfect a certain type of mob leadership, the consigliere, the counselor, the wise advisor who provided stability and continuity. The position of consigliere existed before Michele, but he helped define what it should be. In theory, the consigliere was an advisor to the boss, someone who could give neutral advice and settle arguments, but in practice, the job was often given to gangsters who were partly retired or was just a title without real power. Michele made the consigliere position into something truly important. His advice was wanted because it was wise, not just because of his title. He settled arguments because he could find solutions that worked, not just because he was assigned to do it. He influenced policy through the quality of his advice, not just his formal position. This model of the consigliere, the older statesman whose power came from wisdom and relationships rather than violence or territory, became influential in organized crime. Later consiglieri tried to copy Michele's approach, though few did it as well. Michele's longest and deepest effect was on the Genovese family, where he served for over 40 years. The family he helped shape became the most powerful and successful of the 5 New York families, keeping that position well into the 21st century. Part of the Genovese family's success was because of structural advantages. It controlled profitable areas and operations. But part was because of the culture of caution and intelligence that leaders like Michele created. The family became known for being careful, strategic, and less likely to have the internal wars that destroyed other families. The use of ruling groups rather than single all-powerful bosses. A new idea that Michele helped put in place after Genovese went to prison became a Genovese family characteristic. This sharing of power created stability and made it harder for police to cut off the head of the organization. As one of the commission's senior statesmen, Michele helped keep peace between families. His ability to settle arguments, his relationships across families, and his reputation for fairness made him valuable in preventing fights that could turn into wars. The commission's success during Michele's time, roughly the 1940s through 1970s, was partly because of men like him who put stability and shared profit ahead of conquest and glory. When arguments came up, Michele was one of the voices arguing for talking rather than violence. This helped keep the relative peace that let all families do well. Michele guided many younger mobsters during his career, teaching them the old ways and trying to keep traditional values alive. Some listened and did well. Others ignored his advice and ended up dead or in prison. But his effect on the next generation helped keep certain standards of behavior alive, even as the overall culture was changing. The generation of mob leaders who came up in the 1960s and 1970s, men who knew Michele or knew of him, often tried to copy his approach. They saw that his method worked, that intelligence and patience were more effective than recklessness and violence. This effect went beyond the Genovese family to other families where Michele's reputation was known. Michele died in 1973, just before the mob went into its time of decline. Over the next 2 decades, aggressive federal prosecution, the flood of informers, and internal wars would destroy the families. By the 1990s, the mob's best years were clearly over. Would Michele's presence have changed this path? Probably not. The legal and social pressures were too strong. But his absence removed a voice of caution and wisdom at a very important time. The bosses who led the families in the 1980s made mistakes Michele probably would have advised against. They trusted the wrong people, talked too much, lived too flashy. The mob's decline was not only because of losing elders like Michele, but their absence was felt. The knowledge of the past that they represented, how to operate successfully under pressure, how to keep codes of behavior, how to think long-term, was lost. Younger bosses had to learn these lessons the hard way, often through terrible failures. In the whole history of American organized crime, Michele Miranda has an interesting place. He is not among the most famous names, Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, Gotti, but he is known to serious students of mob history as one of the most successful operators. His life covered the mob's whole best years from Prohibition through the 1970s. He saw and took part in every major development: the Castellammarise War, the creation of the Commission, World War II's effect on organized crime, the post-war boom, the Kefauver and McClellan hearings, Appalachian, and the start of the RICO era. This connection made him a living bridge between times. He linked the early street gangs of the 1920s to the complex criminal businesses of the 1970s. He showed how organized crime changed from violent disorder to structured organization, and he lived long enough to see the start of its decline. Michele Miranda was not a good man. He was a criminal who made money from vice, violence, and taking advantage of people. He hurt people directly and indirectly. His success came at the cost of others' suffering. But within the moral world of organized crime, he was amazing. He was smarter than most, more patient than most, more successful than most. He played a violent game with exceptional skill and survived to die peacefully. An almost miraculous achievement. His life raises difficult questions about success, morality, and the American dream. He came to America with nothing, gained wealth and power, and provided for his family. In that way, he achieved the American dream, but he did it through means that betrayed the dream's real purpose. Maybe the lesson of Michele Miranda is that success and morality are separate things. You can succeed by any measure, except moral ones. You can do well while causing harm. You can build a legacy while destroying others. And you can die peacefully having lived violently. Michele Miranda did all of these things, and that is both impressive and deeply troubling. And so ends the story of Michele Big Mike Miranda, a man who crossed the Atlantic with nothing, who built an empire in the shadows, who helped create the American Mafia as we know it, and who somehow, against every odd, died peacefully in his sleep. In a world where violence was money and betrayal was normal, Michele chose a different path, not a moral path. Made no mistake. He was a criminal who made money from vice and suffering, but a smarter path, a patient path, a path that let him see his grandchildren grow up. He was born in poverty in Italy and died wealthy in America. He saw and took part in the change of organized crime from street gangs to business empires. He served under legends, advised bosses, and survived wars that killed hundreds of men like him. His story raises uncomfortable questions about success, morality, and the American dream. Can we call a criminal's life successful if he dies free and comfortable? What does it say about our society that organized crime offered more opportunity than legal paths? Michele Miranda never wrote a book about his life. He never talked to reporters. He took his secrets to the grave. But his life says a lot about wanting to get ahead, intelligence, and survival in the most dangerous business in the world. Maybe that is the final lesson of Big Mike Miranda. The quietest ones often last the longest. In the underworld, as in life, sometimes the real power is not in making noise. It is in controlling the silence. And there you have it. The complete untold story of Michele Big Mike Miranda, one of the most successful and least known mobsters in American history. If you made it all the way to the end, you are a true crime history fan. Leave a comment and let me know what surprised you most about Michele's story. Do you think he was wise or just lucky? Would his approach work in today's criminal world? Before you fall asleep, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more detailed gangster stories. We have dozens more coming, from forgotten bosses to famous hits, from the birth of the Mafia to its modern decline. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this trip through history. Share it with a friend who likes true crime. Thanks for spending these hours with me exploring the shadows of history. Sleep well and remember, in the words of the old wise guys, see you until next time.